Oh, really? Hi, I guess we're live now, so I'll get started. Hopefully my audio is good. Thanks for coming. Like we just discussed, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on the history of my grandpa's World War II boat, and then we'll move on from there. We'll only have a little bit of time, and then I'll be next door if anyone wants to see the gear. So this part of my presentation, sorry, I don't see my slide notes. This is a story of my grandfather. His name is Earl Chapman Humphrey, and his service in the United States Navy. And here you see a photo of my grandpa and me. And growing up, I spent a lot of time on my grandparents' farm in southeast Iowa. My grandfather lived a long, mostly healthy and happy life. He died in the year 2000 at the age of 80, and I miss him. These are my grandparents circa 1995, as I remember them. But these are my grandparents, circa 1946, long before I was born, before my mother was born. My grandfather was he was in his U.S. Navy uniform here. Here's the same uniform in color. Grandpa was a young man once, as was I, as I realized I'm pressing 40. I'm not as young as I used to be. Grandpa served aboard this ship. This is the USS Houston, CA-30. According to an excellent book, The Ship of Ghosts by James D. Hornfisher, when the crew learned that the Japanese considered her a priority target in World War II, and had already reported her as being sunk, they coined a defiant nickname, the Galloping Ghost of the Java Coast. If you zoom in here, you can see her two forward turrets. These are 8-inch 55 caliber guns. There's 6 of them up front, the 2 turrets. And then midship, this is a really fascinating feature of the Houston. You can see that there's 4 SOC Seagull Scout Observation seaplanes. In World War II, these were launched off of very small catapults by today's standards, and then they would recover them. They'd land in the sea and recover them with cranes and put them back. So there were 2 on each side. Here you can see the left ones. Starboard, and I was never in the Navy, so starboard and port. Left port, so this is the port side. Did I get that right? Sorry. The Houston carried a 1,061-man crew, and my grandpa's in this photo somewhere. A copy of this hung in my grandparents' home forever, the entire time growing up on the farm. And I stared at it hundreds of times, but my grandpa never knew where he was in this picture. I'd ask him, "Where were you, Grandpa? Were you sitting on, what is this, what is this?" And he couldn't remember. And I can't possibly do justice to all of the history here. Here's 2 books. I've got 6 books that are written about the Houston. Here's 2 of them. So check them out if you want. Luckily, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, my grandpa's ship was out to sea. The surviving ships after the Pearl Harbor attack are now massively outnumbered by the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean. So the United States is now at war with a vastly superior force, and my grandpa's on one of those boats. And if we fast forward 3 months to the end of the story, the USS Houston was sunk in the Battle of Sunda Strait at this location. And this location will become important later, because if we get to this part of the talk, I've got lots of slides of the Houston today, 70 years later, and I'm going to be there in August, so wish me luck. Wikipedia has tons of information about the final battle. So it was the United States, Australia, and the Netherlands on one side, and Japan on the other. And they were massively outnumbered in the final battle. So it was 3 boats on the left there, you can see. Then on the right, lots more stuff. They were in trouble. Okay. Here's a pictorial timeline if you're into this sort of thing. that shows in
all the way up.
military time
Wait, now it's
roughly
working
the
again.
position of all the ships and where they run the battle and the engagements and all this stuff, and all this on the internet too. Her final battle,
Woo!
she fought alongside the HMAS Perth, an Australian
Yeah, I
vessel,
mean, I already.
and Perth was sunk just after midnight, and then 20 minutes later, the Houston sank right here. So if I was showing maps of the current plan, of the current dives, both of those things are on there from the historical plan.
That night, when the Houston was sunk, 696 men out of 1,000 were killed. 368 survived, including my grandfather. These are 5 of the ships that were lost in the Battle of the Java Sea, the larger battle. And these are the sorts of newspaper articles that my great-grandparents had about their now missing son. Lots of families were concerned in Iowa, in central U.S. Here's a letter. A full year has passed. The U.S. Navy sends a letter to my great-grandparents. This contains, and my mom has this. This contains no useful information other than my grandfather's official status is still missing. I doubt they found that much comfort, but that's all they knew. 100 Iowans are missing in action in the Pacific Fleet. These are farm boys. So back home, they had no idea what was going on, what happened to their son. Years later, they eventually receive information that where they now are, they're alive, many of them, and they're working the Burma-Thai Death Railway, and I visited this location 2 years ago. You can go there, there's museums, and you can see a lot of the original artifacts in the original line. The conditions were inhumane. The death toll was massive. And there's lots of awful photos, and I won't show you those. This gives you just a feel for how my grandfather lived for about 3.5 years as a prisoner of war. The American and the Allied deaths were a small percentage of the locals. Most of the people that died there were from Malaysia, from Burma, and then the British. So a lot of times going to the reunions, you hear the American story. The local story, in terms of numbers, was far greater. They made a movie about my grandpa's time as a prisoner of war, The Bridge on the River Kwai. So you could check that out. This was made in 1957. Eventually, news reaches Iowa that the Japanese are holding POWs alive. That's my grandfather. You might recognize that photo from earlier. This is the only photo that they ran in the Burlington, Iowa newspaper over and over when they had information. And he was reported safe, held by the Japanese as a POW, which was obviously fantastic news after not knowing what was going on. So, eventually, Japan surrenders. My grandfather returns to Iowa. My grandparents are married. My mother is born. My parents are married. I'm born. And it just makes you realize what a long, fragile, fortunate, in my case, story of survival allows me to talk to you today. So, that's it. Sorry about that. Jumping way ahead to last year, I was cruising around the internet, which I tend to do because I'm a computer geek, minding my own business, and I run across this photo. This is some dude touching my grandpa's boat in the Java Sea. I'm like, what? I had no idea that this was humanly possible. I didn't know where the boat was. I didn't know how deep it was. I didn't know squat about scuba diving. 6 years before, I had gone to Australia, and how it works in Australia is you can do what's called a resort certification. And so basically, if you're game and you're willing to give them money, they will give you a half-day class. They will throw you in a swimming pool with scuba gear on. If you don't drown in the swimming pool, they will take you out on the Great Barrier Reefs and you can dive for a while. It's awesome. So check that out. You can just do snorkeling if you're more comfortable on the surface, and the fish are just fantastic in Australia. And if you're not from Nebraska, if you're from Florida, there's lots of great opportunities to see stuff in the local waters. In Nebraska, not so good. We end up in rock quarries, and the visibility is about this far with all our gear on. So it's more training to go somewhere nice. Oh, I've got my Dive Nebraska shirt on, which I think is hilarious. I don't know if anyone else finds this hilarious. But I'm a member of what's called the Landlocked Scuba Club. I've got another t-shirt. It's a guy in scuba gear riding a tractor through a cornfield. So, Nebraska. So who is this guy? I had no idea who this guy was and how he's touching my, and so I emailed him and then I called him and I'm like, hey, I don't know squat about what's going on, last year. Is this possible? Like, could I work up to, for my bucket list in the next 40 years, can I somehow work up to being able to touch my grandpa's boat? And he's like, well, because he's a Navy diver, so he's got hundreds of dives all over the world. And he's like, what you want to do is you want to go get your open water certification, and you just start slow, and then if that goes good, fly down to Florida. And what we'll do, because you don't have any chance to practice in a lot of the conditions that'll be over there eventually, whatever year you go, we'll practice current diving, right? Because there are no currents unless you want to go in the Missouri River, which you do not want to dive in the Missouri River. So what that entails is you take a reel, like a big fishing line, and you attach it to your side, and you tie off to things, and then as you're surfacing, you're flying up like a kite at a crazy angle, and it'll be fine. You get used to it, it's no big deal. I'm like, really? Okay. And I've got 50 photos of the state of the Houston, and I've got all this gear here, and I'll take all the gear next door if you guys want to see the gear, or we could talk about like basic diving 101 and where you start and how the stuff works. I don't know if anybody has any, so I can talk about puking in Tampa 4 days ago.
Jay, how far down is it?
Yeah. So the Houston, she's a big ship, right? And she's sitting on her side, and she's a little bit buried in the sand, but not too much. And you can touch her at 60 foot of depth off the surface, yeah? And she's about 60 feet thick, so at 120 feet you can get to her bottom, but that's really outside the range of a recreational diver certification like myself, so usually more serious guys will go do that. The US Navy actually just posted a trip that they did where they did survey with side scanning sonar, and then they took divers down there to actually survey the wreck and the state of the wreck. So that was Jerry Ranger, and he's done 4 dives on the Houston, and they've done a lot of really informal surveying. So what they do is they take over huge, what are those called? The schematics of the ship, and then they mark the sections that are missing, right? And sections are missing because she's sitting in seawater for 80 years, or because salvage ships are actively salvaging steel. I've got photos of that too. Unfortunately, these are grave sites, and so it's very unfortunate that some people are pulling it up just for the scrap metal value. And on the Perth, the sister ship that she fought with, they're actually now using dynamite to blow up parts of the ship to bring steel up to the surface, which obviously the Australian families, are not happy about. So at about 60 foot, my plan is to just touch the boat, and that will be the end of my adventure. But it's 10 days on the dive boat over there, and I'm about 12 dives into my career. And I just found out in Tampa that I may have seasickness problems. So I found out, so taking Dramamine apparently helps me a lot. And in July, I'll be diving quite a bit, but not at depth and not off of rocking boats. So it could be that I will have one day on the dive boat and then spend the rest of the time in the resort. So we will see how it goes. Wish me luck. Oh, and there's websites and blogs and things that you can follow if you want to keep track. So 60 foot is not bad. The maximum depth I've done is 62 feet. The visibility, as you can see, is not great. So this is called turbid water, when there's a bunch of junk up in the water. And I've got cool flashlights and stuff that I can show you. And it's wide beam, narrow beam, and depending on how much stuff is in the water, you have to be careful of how you use the flashlight, because the reflection of the light off of the junk in the water actually makes visibility worse. So you flip around with the light settings to try to see what's going on. I was not comfortable with the idea of low visibility at all, which I didn't know until I was in a rock quarry in low visibility. And so I took night and limited visibility diving classes. And now I'm super excited about night diving. How night diving works is you've got lights on, and I've seen these cool videos where they sync all of these mega beam lights to the bottom. So now there's tons of light shooting up from the bottom, and that brings all the plankton in. And when all the plankton are there, all of the rays, these massive manta rays, are attracted to the plankton, so they come in. So now you've got a dozen of these massive rays swimming around in circles, with scuba divers all along the bottom with their lights on, and then snorkelers up top shining their lights down, and it's quite a thing to see. So the videos, I could show you the videos or link to the videos of night diving. So now I've gone from terrified of night diving and limited visibility to super excited about doing that in clear water. The Houston is not in clear water. The Houston is in very turbid water depending on the day, so visibility is not great. But I'm doing all these practice divings at night in this much visibility. And some of the training that I've done was in such low visibility that my instructor was here. I was holding on to him. This doesn't sound fun. I don't think I'm convincing anyone to try scuba diving. But this is intentionally not fun so that I get used to it. I'm holding on to my instructor, and for him to tell me that it's time to do whatever drill, he has to signal which drill we're working on. He gets in my face about this close and signals the drill, right? And then I do the drill. And then he goes to the other guy, because he's got the other student in his right hand and me in his left hand, etc. So I don't recommend coming to Nebraska to scuba dive. There's much better places to scuba dive in the world. So according to this, I have 2 minutes left. Am I still okay? This is Jerry Ranger. Brad's on the left, but Jerry's the guy. I went down to Florida and dove with him. Unfortunately, every time I fly to Florida, a hurricane rolls in and our dive boats got canceled. So we ended up in a freshwater spring, right, which is about depth 65 feet until it turns into cave diving, which I will never do. Cave diving is crazy. But the temperature was very low in Vortex Springs near Pensacola, Florida, if anyone's been out there. But Jerry was great. Jerry's walked me through a ton of the stuff, and he's the dive leader who's been to the Houston 3 times and now 4 times. I found out after I called him, I got in touch with Jerry and asked him all these novice questions about, hey, what would it take to whatever? And he thought he retired. He thought he was done diving until a grandson of a survivor off the Houston said, hey, what would it take for me to work up to this? And he came out of retirement there's actually 6 of us going over, but part of his motivation for coming out of retirement was to try to keep the dive team going so that hopefully we can protect the dive site.
When do you expect to be able to actually get out there?
August 23rd is when I land in Jakarta, and then it's about a 2.5.
This August, this coming one?
Yep.
Yeah, wow.
Yep, no sweat. Is that I'm done, or I'm overtime? I'm overtime. So anyway, I'm going to take all this gear next door if you want to come and hang out and see the gear. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.